Jaide Hinds Clarke and Dr. Jules Boykoff, athletes and advocates with a lot to say. Check them out this Saturday for our first episode of Beyond the Game on Nuts and Bolts Sports. Good evening and welcome to the first episode of Beyond the Game. I'm your host, Zachary Draves of NBS. This is a show where we examine the intersections of sport, social justice, and society. In light of the recent events, we wanted to create a space for athletes, coaches, writers, activists, and academics to share their perspectives. And we are very fortunate today to have this evening two extraordinary individuals. We have Jaide Hinds Clarke, who is a former University of Richmond basketball player and a social justice activist. And we also have Dr. Jules Boykoff, a former Olympic soccer player and professor of political science at Pacific University and a renowned Olympic historian. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Inaugural show, no less. All right.
That's right, indeed. So just really wanted to start this conversation off by really wanting to hear your thoughts on what has been happening during this time. Jaide, I'll start with you. What has been your reaction to these recent events?
Yeah, I think right now there's an incredible amount of movement from people, from student athletes. I think with everything that's going on, it's really hard not to stay in tune with what's happening. But I think right now the movement and the energy around the recent events, you couldn't ask for anything else. I think, right now with everything that's going on, I think it'll continue to stay in the conversation around social justice and equity. And to me, I just feel like it's incredible how many people are stepping up, showing out and standing up for what they believe in.
Indeed. And Dr. Boykoff, the same question to you.
Well, it's a fascinating historical moment, unprecedented, really, in the sense that, of course, we're getting smashed with the coronavirus as we speak here. And we've obviously had a pretty weak-kneed approach from the federal level in terms of dealing with it. And thus, it's sort of spiraled out of control and put sports on hold, thereby giving, for the large part, a lot of time for professional athletes to slow down and think more deeply about what's going on in society. Astride that, you've got this zeitgeist of athlete activism, which is only getting stronger by the day here. More and more athletes feeling the courage and the need to speak out on the issues of the time. And then you've got what's going on at the college level and all these athletes reporting for so-called volunteer practices, which are really anything but volunteer. For anybody that played sports at the college level realizes they're just about mandatory, if not mandatory in name. And we're seeing a spike in coronavirus cases, which puts everything in very sharp relief. And when I say everything, I mean the capitalist undergird of the sport industry in the United States when it applies to college sports. And so you're seeing more and more athletes understand this moment and realize that money is at stake, and that is what's driving it. It's not about global health. It's not about public health. It's not about the health of athletes. And in fact, it seems like from the perspective of what a lot of people are saying about we need to push ahead with sports, that athletes are viewed more and more as expendable. And I think all these dynamics together point to an increase in the amount of athlete activism, athletes speaking out with their ideas in this perfect and important moment.
Indeed. I mean, we're living in this very remarkable time where all of these things are converging, and then it has unleashed this new surge of athlete activism that we had not seen really going back to the 1960s, if we think about it in terms of, multiple athletes from all different walks of life and all different levels of athletics getting involved. And I'm glad, Dr. Boykoff, you mentioned what's going on among student athletes. And what we've been seeing in terms of student athlete activism is student athletes at different universities putting forth different demands, different expectations in terms of how they want to be treated, how they want to be represented, and what action they want to see from the universities that they represent on the athletic field, and in the athletic arena, I should say. And Jaide, I wanted to ask you, as a recent graduate who played basketball at the University of Richmond, what has been your reaction to this recent surge of specifically student athlete activism?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think my time at the University of Richmond, as a student athlete, it almost constantly feels like you're navigating between your identity as a student athlete, but all of your other social identities. And I think now more than ever is a time where student athletes are recognizing that those two things are not and have never been separate, and you can't analyze them separately. So I think, the increase in the use of platform is incredible. And I think it's going to really show, athletic administrators and coaches just really how important it is that, all of those identities are equally weighed and really acknowledged at the same time.
Yes, and we've been seeing at USC, we've been seeing it at the University of Texas, we've been seeing it at Northern Illinois University, we've been seeing it at many major universities, Division I universities, put forth plans, put forth demands and programs that make sure that this conversation isn't, for the moment, isn't going anywhere, even as, schools return using that word loosely because of obviously with what's going on with COVID. And then also Dr. Boykoff, obviously you teach at a university. What has been, at this point, what has been your experience, and what have you heard from your colleagues and athletes that you have any connections with at your university?
Right. So I teach at Pacific University here in Oregon, and I've been really pleased with the response from the university, not rushing back into anything and really taking the health of the workers at the university as well as the students at the university and making that paramount. I've noticed over the years, we're a Division III school, our programs in sports, and yet those student athletes, as they're called, are actually working very long hours in the gym and at practice and studying the tapes. It is enormous. I played Division I soccer in college, and I don't think I spent nearly that much time. This was, of course, a while back now in the 90s, but still, nevertheless, I'm just intrigued and sometimes curious about the amount of time that they spend. I'm glad to know that we've been taking it cautiously, and the fall sports like football and soccer that are contact sports have been put on hold for now. Probably look like they'll happen in the spring, if that, depending on how we can corral coronavirus. And so my university and the conference that we're in has already made steps to address coronavirus head on.
That's amazing. That's really amazing to hear. And Jaide, just to kind of go off on what Dr. Boykoff was saying, obviously, as was mentioned, you just recently graduated from the University of Richmond, but have you gotten, and you're going back for your master's degree at the University of Richmond, is that correct?
I'm actually going to VCU for grad school.
VCU, okay. What has been some of the protocols that have been put in place at VCU that you are aware of?
So as far as I know right now, in terms of students returning, I know for me, I don't return back to campus until August 17th. And there hasn't really been much word yet if that's going to remain in person. Right now, it's still in person. They haven't said anything about if there's going to be online opportunities. And specifically for my grad program, I know there's not that many of us. So I know that it could look different for the school at large, but they've sent out a ton of different ways that they're making sure that, they're following protocol, making sure that students are safe. But in terms of returning back to school right now, it's scheduled to be in person.
Okay. And have you heard anything in terms of what the athletic department is doing or what student athletes are doing at VCU that sort of mirror what these other schools have been doing?
Yeah, I think right now VCU has some athletes returning. I know since I'm a recent grad of University of Richmond, I know some athletes are back there as well. But I know like University of Richmond and the A10 in general has postponed fall sports. And like Dr. Boykoff said, looking to maybe do that in the spring semester if, we can corral the coronavirus. But that's as much as I know at this point.
And just as, sports returning, or at least professional sports returning, obviously this week we saw, or these past 2 weeks, we saw the NBA, we saw WNBA returning today, we saw Major League Baseball return this week, and obviously we saw in Major League Baseball, every player on the New York Yankees, every player on the Washington Nationals take a knee before the start of the game. We saw Mookie Betts of the Los Angeles Dodgers take a knee. We saw the manager of the San Francisco Giants take a knee. And so what you've been seeing, and then obviously in the WNBA and in the NBA, there has been very visible acts of activism, and saw Black Lives Matter painted on the courts and wearing T-shirts and messages on their jerseys. And Dr. Boykoff, I'll start with you in terms of just getting your reaction to what you're seeing on the professional level.
Sure. Well, it's exciting and really interesting on one hand. I think the bigger historical lesson is then whenever we see vibrant social movements in the streets making demands, that tends to carve out space for athletes to step up and become athlete activists. And that's exactly what we saw in the 1960s, as you were alluding to before, Zachary. And it's what we're seeing today. There are actions in the streets across the United States, oftentimes in places where we don't even see activism usually, like small towns here in Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from. Klamath Falls is not exactly known as a bastion of activism, and yet they've been having Black Lives Matter protests. And so all these protests around Black Lives Matter, before that and during that, around the pipeline issues, indigenous protesters out front protesting against the injustices, environmental and otherwise, regarding those pipelines, all of that combines to create space for these athletes to speak out. It's kind of amazing to see all these athletes taking a knee now. When you look at the National Women's Soccer League, almost every single athlete, when they started off again, and they were really the first professional league to get going, almost every athlete took a knee in one of those first matches, and one woman didn't, and she got the pressure, like, why weren't you putting your knee on the ground to honor Black lives? And you think about how that's a total flip from what happened when Colin Kaepernick was doing this, when Michael Bennett was doing this, when Megan Rapinoe was doing this, and they were catching enormous amounts of flack for it. Now the tables have flipped, and now if you're not actually standing up for Black lives in a visible, outspoken way by taking a knee on the pitch, you're asked the tougher questions. And I think that all has to do with the movements that have moved into this space and made huge demands and are really forcing change at a breakneck pace.
And I like how you pointed out that there has been this dramatic cultural shift just from a few years ago, because you rightly pointed out when Colin Kaepernick started taking a knee, and then when others started taking a knee, Megan Rapinoe and many others, there was a lot of criticism levied toward them, and still is right now. But now you're seeing a shift to where you almost are anticipating and expecting athletes to engage in some sort of protest, whether it be taking a knee or otherwise. And I'm also glad you pointed out that the National Women's Soccer League were the first to really engage in this public form of protest in the immediate aftermath of what has been happening. And Jaide, same question really to you. What's been your reaction to what's been happening on the professional level?
Yeah, I think when sports first were canceled or there was a break, I think we all saw the different reactions from fans pretty much everywhere. And, to me, that shows, how big of a platform athletes have and how much sports mean to people in general. And, right now athletes are leaders and have always been leaders and role models. And I think right now it's really forcing people to take an interest in athletes at all levels, taking interest in their lives, not only just on the court, but off the court as well, and trying to really understand how their experiences affect them both on and off the court. And, my initial reaction was, there have been a lot of athletes who have used their platform far before this. And so now I think you're really starting to see a culmination of all that come together, and all the work that people, even right now, who have not been, who have not received any credit for the work that they've done and some of the activism that they've portrayed. I think now you're kind of seeing, the results of that. And I think it's pretty incredible that all of these different organizations are, even, we hear conversations about performative activism, but I think right now, to look at the positive, people are seeing how organizations are reacting to this, and whether people agree with it or not, it's happening. And I think it really gives athletes not only the platform to speak about how they're experiencing diversity and inclusion on their teams, but also just in their lives in general.
Absolutely. And then ultimately, obviously, as both of you know, there's going to be people who are going to push back on it and have pushed back on it for some time. And just, in terms of playing devil's advocate, there's a lot of people who are saying, I just want sports to be for sports. I want it to be an escape from what's happening in the real world, especially at this time, given all the circumstances that we are living with, COVID and, the protests that are happening. So Dr. Boykoff, what would you say to those people who want to separate sports from the rest of society?
Well, I would say for starters, they're kind of living in a fantasy land. If you look at the way sports are already arranged in this country, just look at the professional sports we were just talking about. There are military flyovers at all these games, military nights at these various places. You have mascots of teams that until very recently in the Washington, D.C. area are racial slurs. And so politics is already there, whether they like it or not. That's what I mean by they're already in a fantasy land. As you mentioned at the outset, Zachary, a lot of my research and writing has been on the Olympic Games. And it's always been funny to me that someone who's running the Olympic Games can say that politics and the Olympics shouldn't mix. After all, the whole way it's set up from the beginning to end is political. The teams at the beginning of the Olympics march in as a country, thereby inflaming nationalism. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, you could have all the pole vaulters walk in together from all the different countries, all the figure skaters in the Winter Olympics walk in all together. It doesn't take the imagination of an avant-garde poet to come up with new ways of arranging the games that might be considered a little bit less political. But so the Olympics are political through and through, and sports are as well. We've already made those decisions. Usually when people say that they don't want to have sports in their politics, what they're actually saying is they don't want to have a certain type of sports in their politics. And that certain type of politics tends to be progressive politics that they don't want to have anything to do with. And they want to just keep things status quo, keep it the same. And that's a form of politics as well, just conservative politics.
Absolutely. And you rightly pointed out, we're already bombarded with political messaging around us every time we watch a game or go to a game. We already see that form of militaristic style of politics in the form of military nights and flyovers. We don't think of those as political acts, but in the grand scheme of things and in the broader context, they really are. And I'm so glad you pointed out the Olympics, and we're going to get into that in just a moment, because the Olympic Games itself, the history of it is founded on politics, and the bidding process, all of those dynamics that go into putting together an Olympic Games are itself political, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But Jaide, just to follow up, what would you say to those people who say they want, sports to be completely separate from the rest of society?
Right. Just to go off of what Dr. Boykoff already said, you can't. And I think that's what people are also realizing. Like I said before, people are taking an interest in, their athletes' lives as a result of all that's happened in the world recently. And, you go up to fans, myself, I go up to fans at the end of the game, every single game at the University of Richmond, and say hello. And I think it's important that those fans are engaging with me, on the court, but are also able to see and take a deeper dive into my experience and take a deeper dive into my identities and how that affects me. Because as much as I may be on the court playing a sport, at the end of the day, after I get off that court, and even while I'm on that court, I'm experiencing a ton of different things that affect my experience. So, if people are saying they want their sports separate from politics, people can't be separate from their identities and can't be separated from the different injustices they face every day. And so I think that's an unrealistic, expectation. And like Dr. Boykoff already said, that you're ultimately living in a fantasy if you think that.
That's a great point. Absolutely. Especially just as an example, you're seeing NBA players and WNBA players really saying the name of Breonna Taylor specifically, because let's not forget that her killers have not been arrested. And so, it's hard to separate from that reality when there was a gross injustice and there's no accountability for that injustice. And so, that leads me to, talking about how we make sure that this movement is on an intersectional basis, because obviously, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and their murders were caught on tape, but we can't also forget about Breonna Taylor. We can't forget about Tony McDade, who was a Black transgender man who was killed by police in Tallahassee, Florida. We can't talk about the already epidemic of Black trans women and other trans women of color who are being murdered with impunity. And so, Jaide, I'll start with you on this question. What would you like to see going forward in terms of making sure that this movement is intersectional?
Right. I never learned about intersectionality until my freshman year in college. And, I think that was a pivotal moment in my career. I really started to understand some of the things that I was experiencing and some of the ways that I was feeling as a result of all the different factors that play into my identities and my experiences. But I think, what I would like to see is people really buying into the fact that, social justice movements and social justice in general is intersectional, and it has to be. I can't separate my identities as a Black woman, as an LGBTQ identifying person. You can't separate those things. And I think when you start to separate them, then you're excluding people out of the conversation. And, for me, in my experience, I think it's been very powerful when people acknowledge, my personal experiences and the way that, my identities play out and come together. And I think with this movement, just embracing everybody, that's, one of the basic things that you talk about in intersectionality. And so I think it's just really important for people to understand that there's a multitude of experiences, and my experience is going to be totally different than somebody else's. But just really finding ways to make sure people feel included and make sure they feel supported, because at the end of the day, I think that's the biggest thing. When people feel like they have a voice and they're seen and they're represented, I think that's when we can really start to make lasting change.
Absolutely. And Dr. Boykoff, you alluded to what's been happening on the ground in Oregon, and the work that's being done by Indigenous activists and Indigenous communities to address things like environmental concerns and environmental injustice, which ties into intersectionality, making sure that everyone is represented and everyone's concerns are validated and those movements are supported. So same question to you. What would you like to see going forward in ensuring that this movement is intersectional?
Right. Well, I mean, if intersectionality is the understanding that oppressions compound depending on one's identity or group's identity, then it seems like the start is to engage in intersectional analysis, understanding how these factors compound and how they play out in real life. And there's a lot of really important research and writing that's being done on that, deeper understanding happening every day. I guess in my own mind, at least, I sort of differentiate that intersectional analysis from intersectional activism. So taking that analysis and then putting it into practice by putting forth activist movements that are truly intersectional. Zachary, you mentioned what's happening here in Portland. It's definitely a Black-led movement here in Portland that's brought along Indigenous voices in really important ways, whether it's land acknowledgements at the outset of different events, or whether it's inviting Indigenous speakers to talk about how the experiences between African Americans and the Indigenous populations in Oregon and beyond resonate in particular ways. And so moving from sort of an intersectional analysis, which is key to get the whole thing off the ground, to on the ground intersectional activism is a lot easier said than done. It's not always going to be simple. There's going to be mistakes along the way. But I think if people are patient with each other and continue to work with each other in good faith, we can really see that happen. And in Portland, which has just been a hotbed of activism for the last almost 60 days, fighting for Black lives and now against police brutality, we've seen intersectional movements coming together and really making some big change and big waves. And now all of a sudden has the national media attention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then also tying into that, what's been going on with the effort to change the names and mascots of certain teams. I mean, obviously we saw what happened with the Washington football team. And now you're seeing other teams at the professional level and also trickling down to the local level, seeing changes in terms of names of schools, mascots that really are offensive to indigenous communities, and making sure that indigenous communities are visible, are respected and validated, and that their concerns are validated. And then Dr. Boykoff, just to touch upon what's been going on with the Olympics. This week was supposed to be the start of the Olympics in Tokyo. Obviously, COVID pushed it to a year from now. And you have done extensive work on the Olympic Games, the intersection of politics and the Olympics. And you've written a lot of excellent pieces for The Nation magazine with the great sports writer Dave Zirin on the Olympics. And you've been closely following and analyzing what's been going on with this movement that's happening in Tokyo and elsewhere to really stop the Olympics from happening altogether in Tokyo and in other parts of the world. What is your sense of where things are at when it comes to the future of the Olympics?
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to just say something about what you astutely pointed out, Zachary, about the rise of indigenous activism against native mascots and how that actually fits into this moment in really important ways. There's a scholar whose thinking and writing I enormously admire named Jacqueline Keeler. She's Diné, which is to say Navajo, and Yankton Dakota Sioux. And she runs an organization called Eradicating Offensive Native Mascotry. And lately, she's been speaking out, talking about how were it not for the fact that Black Lives Matter exists and has been pushing forward, we probably wouldn't have seen this kind of progress on the mascotry front. And on all these companies now that are reconsidering these racist brand figures that they have, whether it's on a butter label or something else. And so there's an interplay between those two, which I think also amplifies what we were talking about before and what Jaide was mentioning about the importance of intersectionality. In terms of the Olympics, it's been just this unprecedented and fascinating unfurling of events over the last few months. Back in March, the International Olympic Committee was saying that they weren't even thinking about the words postponement, let alone cancellation. And then only a week later, they were postponing the games under enormous pressure. The question is, what happened between that time? Well, for starters, a lot of athletes spoke out. There was serious concern among Olympic athletes from around the world who were wondering, how can we possibly have an Olympic Games amid a coronavirus pandemic? That's dangerous for global health. That's certainly dangerous for athlete health. And more of them started speaking out. Second, you saw these sport organizations, such as the Canadian Olympic Group, the people that oversee the Olympics in Canada, who said, you know what? If you host those Olympics in Tokyo this summer, we're not going to send our athletes. And that was a de facto boycott and an incredibly bold move. They were followed almost immediately by the athletes from Australia, and also then Portugal and Germany. And once you had that tide of groups saying they weren't going to show up to the games, the International Olympic Committee almost had no choice but to postpone them. And that's exactly what they did. My point is this: in the absence of real deal IOC, International Olympic Committee leadership, where the president of the International Olympic Committee was actually saying that he was listening to people like President Trump, who was saying that the coronavirus was going to be a done deal by mid-April. In the absence of the leadership, you saw athletes speaking up in that vacuum. And were it not for that upsurge in voice, They might have tried to press ahead even longer to make the Olympics happen this summer in Tokyo, which is obviously not a safe thing to do. Ask any public health expert, and they will tell you it is a super bad idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really just calls into question the entire future of the Olympics going forward, because a year from now, these athletes are expected to go to Tokyo. But then what happens in 2024? What happens in 2028? Especially, there's a movement going on in Los Angeles, to essentially stop the Olympics from happening in Los Angeles altogether.
Yeah. So just yesterday in Tokyo, there were big protests against the Tokyo Olympics. And it was interesting to me to see the way it was covered in the international media, because it was largely portrayed as protests against the Olympics because of the fact that coronavirus is here and just what I was talking about during a global health pandemic. But I'm glad you asked that, Zachary, because it actually goes much deeper. The Olympics, the word is out about the Olympics now. And activists pretty much pop up in every potential Olympic city to raise big questions about the patterns around the games. The patterns I'm talking about include overspending. They include the militarization of the public sphere. They include the displacement of everyday people and forced eviction in order to make way for the Olympics. They include a ton of greenwashing, where Olympic honchos say that they're going to be environmentally sound and make all these environmental gains, and then there's very little follow through. There's just a string of broken promises when it comes to the Olympics that has given rise to these different groups that have popped up in every city. You mentioned Los Angeles, and they have been incredibly savvy in their pushback against the Los Angeles 2028 games. Let's not forget that the only reason Los Angeles got the 2028 games was because there were only 2 cities left standing for the 2024 Olympics after all these other cities dropped out because of activist pressure, because of politicians who were elected to be the mayor of the city and said they didn't want to host the Olympics. They were elected on a platform of no to the games. And so there were only 2 cities standing left. It was Paris and Los Angeles. And out of a sort of desperation, the International Olympic Committee decided that they would assign both the 2024 and 2028 Olympics to Paris and Los Angeles, respectively. This gave more time to those in Los Angeles to rally their activist group and their members, who are all part of a big coalition. And because typically the lead time is 7 years, but in the case of Los Angeles, it was 11 years. And there's been the rise of this pretty remarkable group called NOlympics LA. And they emerged out of the Democratic Socialists of America, and more particularly their Housing and Homelessness Committee. And they are immensely talented activists, writers, thinkers. They've got people working in Hollywood. One of the people on their film crew produced his own Netflix film. They have people who are great writers and journalists. They've got on-the-ground organizers who are involved in different groups across the city, from the LA Tenants Union to Black Lives Matter. And so they've built up a lot of momentum against the Los Angeles 2028 games. And Tokyo and everything that's gone wrong there has only given them more grist for the pushback. Final point with them, I started off by talking about the Tokyo activists and how they're raising all these big questions that have become sort of endemic problems to the Olympics. The people in Los Angeles have been working with those in Tokyo. And in fact, last summer in 2019 was the first ever international anti-Olympic summit, where you had activists from around the world come together. Los Angeles sent a contingent of almost 20 people there. There were tons of organizers, of course, from Tokyo and beyond. And then South Korea as well. You had people who were involved in anti-Olympics activism in Rio de Janeiro, in Jakarta, where they were considering a bid. You had some people who were involved in anti-Olympics activity in London around the 2012 games. And they all came together and they shared strategies and tactics and figured out how they might move forward together. And so that's pretty exciting development for those in anti-Olympic circles, because prior to that, it was sort of like, a whack-a-mole game at the county fair. The Olympics would be coming to one city, the activism would hop up, the IOC or the police, try to knock it down again, and then it would pop up in a different city later. And so this is trying to coordinate efforts, so it's not such a whack-a-mole scenario, but more of a kind of transnational, no Olympics anywhere kind of situation. That is their motto, no Olympics anywhere.
And that really speaks to how much of a shift has been happening in terms of how we view the Olympics and how we discuss the Olympics. And again, just really seeing what the overall future of the Olympics will look like. We are just about out of time, but I do want to finish with one more question for both of you. I'll start off with Jaide. Jaide, in your estimation, where do you think we go from here? And also tie in another question there. Where do we go from here? And then let us know about where you can be reached at, the work that you're doing, and resources that you want to provide.
Yeah, I think where we go from here is just being patient and recognizing that we're all still learning. I think once we recognize that we're all still learning and we can make mistakes, the work is going to continue to be done. But when people feel like there's not a space to make mistakes, that's when people start to get closed off. And so I think acknowledging that is huge. And just because I'm a recent grad and college athletics is on my mind, just thinking about how student athletes can be supported long term, not just because there's a lot of energy around this movement, but moving forward. And as I mentioned to you before, Zachary, I'm working with an advisory board for Return on Inclusion, which is going to be an incredible platform for coaches and athletic administrators. There will be several modules for them to go through related to issues of diversity and inclusion and how they can better support their athletes. And we're really excited for the launch for that. I think that'll be a great way to continue learning and then take that learning and put it into practice. But moving forward, I think it's really just being patient and continuing to learn, learning about intersectionality and all there is that goes into supporting student athletes, but just supporting people in general. And I can be reached at, like you just put up, my business page, Hinds Clarke Co. I started that in April, and just coming out of coronavirus, I was thinking a lot about younger athletes and the fact that they may have lost their AAU seasons or their club sports. And I really just came up with that as a way to keep young athletes motivated during a time where it was very easy. I know when I got out of my last game, I was like, well, what do I do now? So just thinking about them and kind of giving them ways to stay motivated. And then my personal Instagram is JJ Clarke, and I can be reached there as well as my website at hindsclarkco.com.
That is awesome. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. And then Dr. Boykoff, same question. Where do we go from here? How can you be reached at, and other resources that you want to provide?
Thanks, Zachary. So, that sounds amazing. First of all, what Jaide you have going, and I'm really excited to see where that goes in the future. So big congrats to you. That must have been an enormous amount of work to get off the ground. One thing that I think about a lot is how we think about history. And if you think back to 1968 and the Mexico City Olympics, where Tommy Smith and John Carlos famously thrust their black glove fists into the Mexico City sky, we know afterwards they were persecuted by the United States Olympic Committee, who, under the pressure of the International Olympic Committee, booted them out of the Olympic Village. They had very difficult lives. It was hard to get jobs. Their family lives suffered in major ways. And it was only recently that they've been getting the public respect that they have long deserved. President Obama had them both and honored them at the White House. ESPN is now honoring them. But there were many decades where they were out in the political wilderness having a very difficult time of it. I guess I think about that a little bit when I see athletes showing the courage to speak out today, whether on issues of inequality, around issues of racism, around issues of LGBTQ inequality and how that plays out through various systems. And, when we see them speaking out, they can often seem disruptive, like they're causing trouble or something like that. And just as Smith and Carlos were disruptive when they were on the medal stand, if you want to think about it that way. And so as we have conversations with different people, especially ones that necessarily don't agree with us politically, I hope we can kind of keep that in mind and try to use that as a way of talking to them, is that in the rear view window of history, people are often treated much more kindly. In the moment when they're acting, they're not, even though they deserve to be treated kindly. And maybe that's sort of a way of thinking through how these athlete activists are working. What's in store is very hard to tell right now. We're at this unprecedented moment in the history of the sportverse in the United States. And you've got a number of athlete activists speaking out, as we've been talking about. You've got more and more people receptive to their ideas. And this is all happening amid the coronavirus, when sport has been slowed down, at least relatively, to where it typically is at this point. And so for me, there's so much that's uncertain, but I love that. And I feel like this is such an exciting time to move into that uncertainty, to help people who have not had the stage before get to speak out and see from their perspective, especially people who've been marginalized for too long, get their perspectives on what's happening so we can learn from them and we can press forward. You know, this is a time for young people leadership. This is a time for BIPOC leadership. This is a really exciting time if people can just slow down, think about what really matters, and make space for those who very much deserve it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Boykoff, could you let everybody know where you can be reached at?
Sure. So I'm mostly on social media. I'm on Twitter. So just my name at Jules Boykoff. And then I also catalog my writings and research at my website, which is just my name, julesboykoff.org. So that's where you can go. And I'm happy to hear from listeners. I love the interactions. So if you have a question or something, feel free to email me or hit me up on Twitter.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I can't thank both of you enough for taking the time to have this really amazing conversation. Thank you both for the work that you're doing, for your visibility, for your presence, and for everything that you all stand for. It is really appreciated and really needed at this time. So Jaide Hinds Clarke and Dr. Jules Boykoff, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And to all of our viewers out there, be sure to catch more episodes of Beyond the Game right here on Nuts and Bolts Sports. I am your host, Zachary Draves, and on behalf of everybody at NBS, take care and have a good night.